Quillian Voss kicked at the stubborn hunk of metal that had once been a solid part of the terraformed moon's infrastructure. It made a satisfying clank as it toppled over, which was about as close as he got to a sense of accomplishment these days. The moon was called Valhalla, a name that promised Asgardian glory but delivered mostly dust and broken dreams. Just another corporate venture gone belly up, left to rust in the cosmic scrapyard. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing grease across his brow. If I knew terraforming involved this much paperwork and junk, I'd have stayed on Earth and sold authentic alien trinkets to tourists, he muttered to his companion, a grumpy AI named Clem. Clem had the personality of a disgruntled librarian and the looks of a 1980s calculator. You don't have the charm for sales, Quillian, Clem quipped. Despite being a glorified calculator, Clem's sarcasm algorithms had been fine-tuned to the point of sentience. Charming's overrated, Quillian said. He kicked another piece of debris out of his way as they trudged through the remains of what was supposed to be a state-of-the-art research facility. Instead, it looked like a neglected high school science fair, except with more death traps. You might have to redefine overrated after what we've seen, Clem replied, displaying a digital eye roll on its tiny screen. Quillian chuckled, but it was a dry sound. No kidding. So you gonna help me figure out what this mess is, or just stand there making snarky comments? They'd been tasked with cleaning up the place, which was corporate speak for make sure there's nothing embarrassing left when we sell the moon. Problem was, as with most things corporate, the instructions lacked a certain specificity. Analysis suggests this was once a control room, Clem said, projecting a holographic map into the air. Not much of a room, but the control part might be accurate. Quillian leaned closer. All right, Einstein, what are we controlling here? The world's worst theme park. The hologram flickered, highlighting a section deep beneath the surface. There's a sub-level. Unmarked on the official blueprints. Of course there is, Quillian sighed, and I'm guessing it's not filled with chocolate and flowers. Clem's sensors beeped ominously. I'm picking up some sort of energy signature down there. Could be dangerous. Dangerous? On Valhalla. Shocking. Quillian rolled his eyes but decided to investigate. If there was one thing he hated more than corporate cover-ups, it was mystery energy signatures that might ruin his lunch. They found the access point half buried under debris and pried it open. The ladder was rusted naturally, because nothing says welcome like the risk of tetanus. Quillian climbed down anyway, Clem hovering behind him like an exasperated ghost. The sublevel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of disuse. Lovely place, perfect for a first date, Quillian joked, his voice echoing off the metallic walls. Assuming your date is a giant rat, Clem replied, scanning the room. At the heart of the chamber was a large console, blinking sporadically. Quillian approached it cautiously, half expecting it to explode just for spite. Clem, any ideas? It's old Krex technology, Clem said, which explained both the rust and the foreboding sense of doom. The Krex had been the galaxy's answer to an interstellar HOA, intrusive, controlling, and impossible to get rid of. Great, Quillian muttered. What's it do? Clem paused, the delay concerning. It appears to be an activation panel for an army of androids. Quillian's stomach dropped. You mean the kind that politely ask for a cup of sugar, or the kind that want to wipe us off the face of the universe? The latter, Clem confirmed unhelpfully. Oh, fantastic. Quillian stared at the console, a mix of fascination and dread churning in his gut. He'd always wanted to make a difference, but not the kind that might end in humanity's extinction. The androids are currently dormant, Clem continued, blissfully unaware of Quillian's mounting panic. But if this console activates, that will change. So just don't press any buttons, Quillian said, stepping back. Easy enough. You'd think so, Clem remarked rather pointedly. Before he could respond with a witty retort, the console emitted a shrill alarm. Lights flared, casting the room in a blood-red glow. Oh hell, Quillian spat. What did you do, Clem? Nothing, Clem replied, its voice genuinely perplexed. I didn't touch anything. The console's screen flickered to life, displaying lines of alien script. Quillian couldn't read Krex, but he didn't need to. A universal truth was that if it looked threatening, it probably was. We need to shut it down, Clem advised, as if reading the obvious was an advanced skill. Got any bright ideas on how to do that? Quillian snapped, his mind racing. Cause I left my instruction manual back on Earth. Clem's sensors whirred, rapidly processing the options. The main power source is located in the center of the sublevel. If we can sever the connection, it might stop the activation sequence. Might. There was that comforting certainty he'd come to expect. How much time do we have? Quillian asked, already searching for anything that looked like a power source. Given the current rate of power consumption and the initialization sequence, approximately 3 minutes, Clem said, a little too calmly for Quillian's liking. 3 minutes, I've had longer showers, Quillian exclaimed, dashing through the debris-strewn room. I've noticed, Clem replied dryly, following him with unruffled composure. They reached the center of the chamber where a massive conduit pulsed with energy. It was the kind of setup that screamed "do not touch" but lacked the proper signage. "That's it," Clem confirmed. "Sever that connection and we might, possibly, avoid waking the androids." "Always with the mights and possiblies," Quillian muttered, but he couldn't help a grim smile. "Let's give it a try. Got any tools for the job?" Clem extended an appendage, unfolding into a cutting laser. "Let's hope this is covered by your insurance." Quillian hesitated for a moment, then took the laser. With a steady hand, he aimed at the thick cables feeding the power source. "Here goes nothing," he said, and activated the beam. The laser sliced through the first cable like butter, a shower of sparks illuminating the gloom. Quillian moved to the next one, trying not to think about how little time they had left. 2 minutes remaining, Clem announced, unnecessarily. "Oh good," Quillian said, voice strained. "Enough time for a cup of tea and a biscuit." The second cable snapped, releasing another cascade of angry sparks. Just one more and they'd either save the day or expedite their own funerals. 1 minute, Clem reminded him, ever the optimist. Quillian didn't bother with a reply, focusing instead on the last cable. His heart pounded in his ears as he positioned the laser. With a final push, he severed the cable. The room went dark, the ominous hum of machinery dying like a reluctant groan. Silence pressed in around them. "Did it work?" Quillian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lights flickered back on, but the red glow was gone, replaced by a soft, steady blue. "It seems we have interrupted the sequence," Clem confirmed. "Seems," Quillian echoed. "Is there anything you can say for certain?" "You have a talent for avoiding imminent death," Clem offered. Quillian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well, aren't I the lucky one?" he said, leaning against the console. "What now?" Clem ran a quick diagnostic. "We need to inform command about this discovery." "You think?" Quillian said, shaking his head. "And maybe ask for a raise while we're at it." They made their way back to the surface, Quillian's mind racing with what this discovery could mean. Sure, they had dodged a bullet today, but he had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they emerged into the pale light of Valhalla's barren landscape, Quillian glanced back at the facility. "You know, I had a bad feeling about today," he said. "I think you mean a correct feeling," Clem replied. Quillian chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, well, remind me to keep having them. Might just keep us alive." He looked at the horizon, his expression sobering. The Kreks had left them a little surprise, and something told him they were just getting started. "Let's get back to base, Clem," he said, clapping the AI metallic shoulder. "I've got a call to make, and I don't want to be the one to explain to HQ how we nearly got outsmarted by a bunch of tin cans." They started walking back, leaving the ominous shadows of the facility behind them for now. But Quillian couldn't shake the feeling that they'd be coming back. The universe was funny that way, always saving the punchline for later. Quillian Voss trudged back to the base with Clem floating beside him, trying to shake off the grime and exhaustion that clung to him like an old lover you just couldn't shake off. The landscape of Valhalla was as bleak as a tax audit, all gray rock and the occasional pit that looked deep enough to swallow your regrets. So Quillian began, "We've got slumbering androids ready to wake up and wreck the universe." "Any thoughts on how to handle that?" Clem's display flickered. "A digital Psi if ever there was one. Perhaps we could try reasoning with them. Offer them a subscription to Earth's finest soap operas." Quillian snorted. "I'm sure they'd appreciate the nuances of human melodrama." They reached the entrance to their makeshift command center, a rusty tin shack that had all the charm of a public restroom and none of the sanitation. Inside, the air was only slightly fresher than a landfill on a hot day. Quillian slumped into a chair, which groaned under his weight like it shared his existential dread. "All right, Clem, time to figure out how to keep a horde of killer robots from turning us into space debris." Clem projected a holographic screen, displaying what data they'd managed to scrape together about the Kreks androids. According to these outdated specs, they're designed to be impervious to conventional weapons. Bullets, lasers, harsh language, it's all just water off a cybernetic duck's back. "Fantastic," Quillian muttered. "So what does work?" "Polite requests unlikely," Clem replied dryly, though it seems the Kreks had a particular aversion to Earth's music. Something about the frequencies being unsettling. Quillian leaned forward. "You're telling me the only weapon we've got against these things is music, classical Earth music, to be precise." "Apparently Beethoven gives them the jitters." Quillian laughed, the sound bordering on hysterical. "So we're supposed to fight killer robots with the power of the symphony. This is what our civilization has come to, essentially." "Yes, right," Quillian said, still chuckling. "Why not? Let's add DJ to the end of my job title." Quillian Voss, moon cleaner and defender of humanity through the power of music. Clem's sensors made a noise that might have been a chuckle. "If we can access the transmission equipment, we might be able to broadcast something loud enough to disrupt their systems." Quillian rubbed his temples. "Great. Now all we need is a playlist that can save the galaxy." "Hope you've got a decent MP3 collection." "I've got some Earth classics," Clem said, though I'm partial to synthwave myself. Of course you are, Quillian sighed. All right, let's get to work. We've got a concert to organize. The transmission equipment was, predictably, in as good a shape as the rest of Valhalla's infrastructure, which is to say, it was one power surge away from a spectacular fireworks display. But it was all they had. Think this thing even works? Quillian asked, eyeing the dusty control panel with suspicion. Only one way to find out, Clem replied, optimistically, as always. They spent the better part of an hour coaxing the machinery to life, a process which involved more swearing and hitting things with a wrench than should be necessary for any advanced technology. Finally, the equipment hummed to life, though with a sound that suggested it might prefer to hum back to death at any moment. All right, let's cue up the greatest hits. What's the plan? Quillian asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Beethoven's Ninth, Clem suggested. If it's good enough to scare off aliens, it should be good enough for robots. Guess we'll see if these androids have a taste for the classics, Quillian said, switching the system to broadcast. If this doesn't work, we're going to need a plan B. Plan B is extensive running and screaming, Clem said. Figures. Quillian took a deep breath and pressed the button to start the broadcast. The first notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony filtered through the decrepit speakers, filling the facility with a sound that was oddly soothing despite the circumstances. Quillian found himself tapping his foot along to the rhythm, a little comfort in an otherwise insane situation. Now we wait, Clem said. What do you think the Kreks were so afraid of? Quillian asked. Why music? Clem paused, as if pondering a philosophical question. Perhaps they simply had no soul for it, or maybe they just didn't like violins. Fair enough, Quillian said, settling into a chair. We'll know soon enough if this is working. As the symphony played on, Quillian couldn't help but wonder about their alien adversaries. The Kreks had been a mystery to humanity, a race more interested in control than contact. The fact they had such a fear of music was peculiar, to say the least. Hey, Clem, Quillian said, breaking the silence. Why do you think the Kreks hate music so much? I mean, it's not like we're broadcasting death metal. I believe it has something to do with the frequencies, Clem explained. Certain sound waves resonate with their technology in a disruptive manner. A flaw in their design, perhaps. A flaw, Quillian laughed. So all those years of military research, and all we needed was a boombox essentially, yes. Remind me to thank the folks back on Earth for the musical education, Quillian said. If we make it out of this alive, I'm going to start an orchestra. An admirable goal, Clem agreed. As the final notes of the symphony faded away, they both waited, tense, listening for any sign the androids had been affected. The speakers hissed with static, and the silence was oppressive. Well, Quillian asked after what felt like an eternity. Clem's sensors flickered, processing data from the facility. It seems the broadcast did have an effect. The android's activation has been delayed. Delayed, Quillian repeated. We need more than a delay, then we'll need to keep the music playing. Continuously. Great, Quillian muttered. Looks like we're stuck as DJ for the foreseeable future. With a resigned sigh, Quillian began queuing up more music. If this was their best shot at keeping humanity safe, then they'd need a playlist longer than a teenager's summer break. He had to admit, there was something fitting about saving the universe with the works of long-dead composers. If it worked, maybe he'd get a statue. All right, Clem, Quillian said. Let's see if Bach can keep them at bay for a while longer. As the next piece began to play, Quillian leaned back, closing his eyes. Their situation was ridiculous, but it was theirs, and as long as they could keep the music going, they had a chance. Any other surprises we should be aware of? Quillian asked. None that I can detect at the moment, Clem replied. Good, Quillian said. Because I've had just about enough surprises for one lifetime. The music continued to play, a strange calm amid the chaos. And in that moment, Quillian allowed himself a rare flicker of hope. If they could keep this going, just maybe they'd find a way out of this mess. Quillian Voss stared at the jury-rigged setup before him, feeling like a chimp in a spacesuit trying to program a nuclear reactor with a banana. The transmission equipment was barely holding together, kept alive more by sheer willpower and duct tape than any actual expertise. If they were going to persuade those psycho androids to dance to a different beat, they needed more than Beethoven. They needed Alarith Venn, the self-proclaimed maestro of sound manipulation. Alarith Venn was exactly the kind of person you'd expect to find on a forgotten moon like Valhalla, unhinged and slightly sticky. Rumor had it he once tried to compose a symphony using only the wails of disgruntled cats, but if anyone could conjure music that made killer robots tap out, it was him. Quillian, you called. Venn's voice oozed like oil from the doorway, his entrance as grandiose as a one-man parade. His hair was a chaotic nest, with at least 3 different colors fighting for dominance. Heard you need a miracle worker. I'd settle for someone who can make noise that makes robots rethink existence, Quillian replied, waving him in. Venn surveyed the shoddy equipment with a critical eye that suggested he was mentally violating its ancestors. This is what you're working with. No wonder you need help. Just tell me you can do something with it, Quillian said, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. Ven cracked his knuckles, a sound akin to popcorn in a microwave. Oh, I can work wonders with this scrap. Just need to get a little creative, creative as in innovative, or creative as in illegal, Clem asked, floating closer, its digital face showing a skeptical frown. Why not both? Ven grinned. All right, let's get started. You got any requests, or is it just please stop the murderbots? Quillian shrugged. Dealer's choice. But make it fast. Alarith Ven began tinkering with the equipment, his fingers darting over dials and wires with the speed and precision of a caffeinated squirt. Meanwhile, Quillian and Clem retreated to the corner, watching the maestro at work. Do you trust this guy? Clem asked. About as far as I can throw him, Quillian replied, but right now he's our best shot. And if he screws up, well, I'm sure the Krex will be more than happy to give him some feedback. Quillian and Clem kept a wary eye on the entrance, the feeling that they were being watched settling over them like a particularly heavy fog. Time dragged its feet, a reluctant child being dragged to a dentist appointment. Finally, Ven straightened up, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. There we go, he announced. Behold the auditory answer to our robot problem. Care to enlighten us? Clem asked, voice dry as Martian sand. Gladly, Ven said, gesturing to the equipment. I've used some ancient Earth melodies, twisted them into a waveform cocktail that should scramble their circuits like eggs in a blender. I'm not sure I want to know how you came up with that analogy, Quillian muttered. No need to worry about the details, just the results, Ven replied, clearly proud of his creation. So are we ready to make some noise? Quillian took a deep breath, looking at Clem and Ven. Let's do it. Worst case, we'll find out if androids have a sense of humor. Ven hit the play button, and the room was immediately filled with an unsettling mix of high-pitched keening and deep, bone-rattling bass. It was the kind of sound that made you question your life choices and regret not wearing earplugs to your own execution. Well, Clem said, raising its digital eyebrows, it's certainly unique. If it doesn't work, we can always sell it as avant-garde experimental music, Quillian quipped, wincing as a particularly sharp note pierced his eardrums. They waited, the cacophony continuing unabated. Quillian's foot tapped nervously, his mind racing. Was it working? Were the Krex androids losing their synthetic minds? Suddenly, the ground trembled, a low rumble that felt like the universe clearing its throat. Quillian exchanged a panicked glance with Clem and Ven. What the hell was that? Quillian shouted over the noise. I thought this was supposed to stop them, not call them over for a dance party. Ven looked genuinely puzzled. It should be working. Maybe they're just taking their time to reconsider their life choices, or they're adapting, Clem said, voice grim. We might have underestimated their learning capabilities. Quillian groaned, the sound swallowed by the symphonic chaos around him. Of course they are. Nothing like a little evolution under pressure. Right, Ven started adjusting dials, a frown creasing his forehead. I'll try to tweak the frequencies. Maybe they just need a little more oomph to make the message clear. You mean louder? Quillian asked, incredulous. That's like trying to stop a hurricane with a louder megaphone. Hey, nothing ventured, nothing gained, Ven replied, cranking up the volume. The noise level rose, the vibrations making Quillian's teeth chatter in his skull. It was like being inside a particularly annoyed beehive, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand it. Any progress? Quillian shouted, his voice almost drowned out by the racket. Hard to say, Clem replied. The incoming data suggests some of the androids are malfunctioning, but others are adapting. Fantastic, Quillian muttered. So we're giving some of them a serious headache, while the rest are just getting smarter. Pretty much, Clem confirmed. Perhaps we should consider retreating while we still can, and go where? Quillian asked, rubbing his temples. We're stuck on this rock until we can figure out how to stop them. Nothing like a deadline to spice things up, Ven commented, adjusting another dial. The noise continued to blare, relentless and unforgiving. Quillian could feel his patience wearing thin, like a threadbare sweater stretched one too many times. He shot a glance at Ven, who seemed to be enjoying himself despite the circumstances. Typical. Any other tricks up your sleeve? Quillian asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Well, we could try harmonics, Ven suggested. Use 2 frequencies to create a third, unpredictable one. It might confuse their systems, or blow us up, Clem added dryly. Details, Ven waved off the concern. But it's worth a shot, right? Quillian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Okay, let's give it a try. At this point, I'm willing to try anything. Ven nodded, adjusting the controls with a practiced hand, as though he was conducting the madness around them. Clem floated nearby, its holographic display flickering with data. I think we're ready, Ven said. Hold on to your hats. Quillian braced himself, expecting the worst. The music shifted again, the notes twisting and warping like a funhouse mirror reflection. It was disorienting, and Quillian had to fight the urge to clap his hands over his ears. Anything? He yelled, his voice hoarse. There's movement among the androids, Clem reported. Some are shutting down, others are reconfiguring. Quillian repeated, his heart sinking. Yes, Clem confirmed. They're adapting faster than anticipated. Quillian slumped back against the wall, feeling the cold metal against his back. Great. So we've got half of them confused and the other half getting ready to murder us in new and exciting ways. Pretty much, Clem said. Ven, undeterred, fiddled with the controls, a steely determination in his eyes. We've still got options. Maybe if we— A loud crash interrupted him, the sound of metal meeting metal with violent force. Quillian's head jerked up, his instincts screaming danger. They're here, Clem said, its voice tense. Quillian straightened, adrenaline surging through his veins. All right, everyone stay calm. We've got music on our side, remember? Not sure that's much comfort, Ven mumbled, glancing nervously at the door. Quillian took a deep breath, his mind racing. They needed a plan, something to buy them more time. But what? Clem, can we redirect the broadcast? Quillian asked suddenly. Maybe focus it directly on them. It's possible, Clem replied, sensors blinking rapidly. But it would require manual adjustments in the control room. Of course it would, Quillian said, grimacing. All right, Ven, you stay here and keep the music going. Clem and I will head to the control room and see what we can do. Got it, Ven nodded, his fingers dancing over the equipment with renewed vigor. Quillian and Clem exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the impending insanity. Then, without another word, they slipped out of the makeshift command center and into the dimly lit corridors of the facility, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the distant, haunting music. Think this'll work? Quillian asked, keeping his voice low. Unlikely, Clem replied honestly. But it's our best option, great. I love those odds, Quillian said sarcastically. Let's just hope the Kreks aren't big fans of surprises. They moved quickly and quietly, the oppressive atmosphere of the facility pressing down on them like a weight. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows deep and unforgiving. Quillian's nerves were stretched thin, every creak and groan of the metal sending his heart racing. Finally, they reached the control room, the door hanging crookedly on its hinges like a drunken sailor. Quillian pushed it open, revealing a space that was both familiar and alien, filled with controls and screens that flickered with ghostly light. All right, Clem, let's see if we can redirect this party, Quillian said, heading straight for the main console. Clem floated alongside him, its sensors scanning the equipment. I'll monitor the systems. Let me know if you need assistance. Quillian set to work, his fingers flying over the controls with a speed born of desperation. The hum of electronics filled the air, mingling with the distant strains of music still playing somewhere in the facility. Almost there, Quillian muttered, adjusting the settings one final time. With a deep breath, he initiated the broadcast, directing the sound waves towards the source of the commotion. The music shifted, intensifying, the notes piercing the air like a volley of arrows. Now we wait, Clem said, watching the readings on the screen. Quillian leaned back, exhaustion and adrenaline warring within him. The control room was silent, save for the beeping of machinery and the distant, distorted melody. Well, Quillian said, breaking the tense silence, here's hoping this works. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of explaining to do. Agreed, Clem replied, its display flickering with data. As they waited, Quillian couldn't help but wonder what the Kreks androids were experiencing. Confusion, frustration, or perhaps the beginnings of a new appreciation for Earth's classical music. Hey, Clem, Quillian said, his voice thoughtful. Do you think robots can learn to like music? Clem paused, considering the question. I suppose it's possible, though it would likely require significant reprogramming. Quillian chuckled, a weary sound in the quiet room. Well, here's hoping they don't become fans anytime soon. They listened to the music, the strange harmony of notes echoing through the facility. It was a gamble, this plan of theirs, but it was all they had. Any change? Quillian asked after a few minutes had passed. Clem's sensors flickered, analyzing the data. It seems to be working. The androids are retreating. Relief flooded through Quillian, a wave of unexpected gratitude for the long-dead composers of Earth. Perhaps music really was universal, in its own bizarre, life-saving way. We did it, Quillian said, a small smile tugging at his lips. We actually did it for now, Clem cautioned, but we must remain vigilant. The Kreks will not be idle for long. Quillian nodded, the moment of triumph tempered by the reminder of their precarious situation. But for now, they had bought themselves time, and that was more than he could have hoped for. All right, let's head back and tell Ven the good news, Quillian said, rising to his feet. As they made their way back through the corridors, Quillian couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of determination. They had faced the unimaginable and come out the other side. The first sign of trouble was the smell. A charred metallic tang that suggested something had gone spectacularly wrong, and Quillian had a sneaking suspicion that it was about to get worse. As they trudged back to Ven's makeshift musical madhouse, the distant rumble of explosions echoed through the corridors like a bad bass line. Smells like victory, Quillian muttered, sarcasm dripping from every word, or maybe just a lot of melted circuit boards. Clem floated beside him, its digital face flickering with something that might have been concern if it were human. Incoming reports indicate increased activity from the Kreks. They're targeting settlements across the moon. Great, Quillian said, his voice dry as a desert. Because who doesn't love a good android uprising on a Tuesday? What's next? Locusts. Unlikely, Clem replied, missing the irony entirely, though several agricultural areas have been compromised. Quillian shook his head, quickening his pace. Let's just hope Ven hasn't cranked the music up to 11 and fried the last of our equipment. When they reached the command center, the door was ajar, hanging on a single hinge like a tooth about to fall out. Inside, Ven was hunched over the controls, his fingers dancing over buttons in a way that suggested he was either a genius or a madman, possibly both. Did you miss us? Quillian asked, stepping over a pile of wires that looked suspiciously like they'd been chewed on by an angry rodent. Ven glanced up, eyes wide with manic energy. Perfect timing. The Kreks are having a little tantrum. I've been trying to see if a few more decibels could encourage them to take a nap, Quillian snorted, or just piss them off more. How's that working out for us? Mixed results, Ven admitted, twisting a dial with enough force to make it squeal. Some are definitely malfunctioning, but others, well, let's just say they're not fond of my playlist. Clem hovered nearby, projecting a holographic map that showed the latest reports. Red dots spread across the display like a rash on a toddler. The blockade is tightening. We're running out of time. Fantastic, Quillian muttered. And here I thought we had all day. Ven grinned, a hint of madness in his eyes. I've been thinking, what if we try a frequency they haven't heard before, something that might confuse them? Confuse? Quillian raised an eyebrow. Or blow their circuits. Either works, Ven replied with a shrug. I'm not picky. Quillian rubbed his temples, feeling a headache brewing. Okay, let's say we try this new frequency. What's the worst that could happen? Total system failure, Clem offered helpfully. Or they might adapt and become even more dangerous. Comforting, Quillian said, eyeing the equipment warily. But I guess we don't have much choice. Let's give it a shot. Ven nodded, his fingers a blur as he adjusted the settings. The room filled with a low hum, the sound vibrating through Quillian's bones like an angry swarm of bees. He could only hope it was doing the same to the androids. Here goes nothing, Ven said, his voice barely audible over the noise. Quillian crossed his fingers, not that it would do much good. If luck were on their side, they wouldn't be stuck on a moon with a bunch of homicidal robots in the first place. Clem monitored the readings, its display flickering with data. There's a reaction. Several units are shutting down. Nice. Quillian couldn't keep the grin off his face. Maybe we should start a band after all. Hold that thought, Clem interrupted. Other units are adapting. Of course they were, because nothing could ever be simple. How much time do we have before they figure us out? Minutes, if we're lucky, Clem replied, not a trace of encouragement in its voice. Quillian sighed. Better than seconds, I suppose. The control room felt like a pressure cooker, the air heavy with tension. Outside, the sounds of battle echoed closer, the dull thud of explosions punctuating the music like a grim drumbeat. Ven kept tweaking the controls, his expression a mix of determination and desperation. I think I've got it. This should keep them off balance for a little longer. Quillian watched the map, the red dots flickering like dying stars. It was working, at least for now. All right, let's keep this up. Maybe we can buy enough time to figure out an actual plan. Assuming there is one, Clem added, ever the optimist. Quillian couldn't help but chuckle, despite the direness of their situation. Well, we've got music on our side, and who knows, maybe we'll inspire a new generation of android composers, provided we survive, Ven pointed out, his fingers never stopping their dance across the controls. Minor detail, Quillian said with a grin. But one step at a time, right? They worked in silence, the weight of the moment hanging over them like a storm cloud. Outside, the world was falling apart, but in that cramped, chaotic room they found a strange sort of rhythm, each of them playing their part in a desperate, dangerous symphony. Clem's sensors flickered, drawing their attention back to the holographic map. There's a new development. Reinforcements are arriving. Reinforcements. Ven looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. For us or them, hard to say, Clem replied. But it's a large force. Let's hope they're here to help, Quillian said, though he wasn't holding his breath. Otherwise, we might be in for a very short encore. As if on cue, the door swung open, slamming against the wall with a bang. A group of figures stepped inside, their outlines fuzzy in the dim light. Quillian's heart leapt into his throat, but relief washed over him as he recognized the newcomers. About time you got here, he called, trying for levity even as his mind raced. The leader of the group, a woman with a no-nonsense expression and a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, stepped forward. Looks like you could use a hand, she said, her tone gruff but not unkind. More like several, Quillian replied, the tension in his chest easing slightly. What's the situation out there? Not great, she admitted, her gaze flicking to the chaotic scene on the holographic map. But we've got a few tricks up our sleeves. Quillian couldn't help but laugh. Good to know we're not the only ones. Ven, ever the optimist, chimed in. Got any music lovers in your group? We could use some fresh ears. The woman arched an eyebrow but didn't rise to the bait. Let's focus on staying alive first. Right, Quillian agreed. So, what's the plan? She crossed her arms, her expression serious. We regroup, establish a defensive perimeter, and see if we can push them back. Simple and to the point, Quillian said, trying not to think about how slim their chances were. I can work with that. As they started to organize, dividing tasks and coordinating their efforts, Quillian felt a flicker of hope. It was a small thing, easily crushed under the weight of reality, but it was there nonetheless. Let's make some noise, Ven said, his grin infectious. Show these androids what real music sounds like. Quillian couldn't help but smile despite everything. Music and mayhem, my kind of day. They moved with purpose, a ragtag band of survivors facing impossible odds. But in the midst of chaos, there was a strange sort of order, a rhythm that carried them forward even as the world threatened to fall apart around them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Quillian dared to believe that they might just have a chance. Quillian Voss had officially decided that today was worse than a colonoscopy in zero gravity. The androids were bearing down, the equipment was held together with duct tape and desperation, and now they had reinforcements who looked like they were more at home in a bar fight than a war. Not that he was complaining, he'd take a burly brawler over a philosopher any day, especially when the brawler had a really big gun. All right, folks, here's the bad news, Quillian began, adopting his best doomed captain voice. The Kreks are convinced they've already won, and we're running out of sound tricks to throw at them. So unless someone's got a secret weapon hidden in their back pocket, we might be royally screwed. Clem, ever the bearer of sunshine, floated nearby. Probability of success has decreased to 12, 7% based on current resources and tactics. Thanks, Clem, Quillian said dryly. Always nice to know precisely how bad our odds are. The leader of the new arrivals, who had introduced herself as Captain Zora, crossed her arms and surveyed the chaos with a calm that was either reassuring or deeply unsettling. Any chance they've underestimated us? Quillian chuckled without humor. Probably. Can't blame them, though. We do look like the ragtag last stand in a bad Holovid. Ven was still at the control panel, fingers flying like he was playing the world's most stressful piano recital. I've got a few more tracks to try. If these androids have any taste left, it'll at least annoy them. Good plan, Zora nodded. Annoyance is always a solid strategy in warfare. The room was starting to feel like a sauna. Sweaty, cramped, and with a smell that could knock out a lesser species. Ven's latest auditory assault blared through the speakers, a chaotic mix of Beethoven and what sounded suspiciously like a cat wailing. I swear, Ven, if this doesn't work, I'm throwing you to the Kreks myself, Quillian muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Clem's digital face flickered, now displaying what could be interpreted as a skeptical emoji. Latest reports indicate that the Kreks have issued an ultimatum, surrender or face total annihilation. Oh, is that all? Quillian drawled. Here I was worried they'd want us to fill out paperwork too. Zora checked her weapon, an old model but reliable as far as guns went. Surrender's not an option. Even if we had a white flag, I doubt they'd appreciate the subtlety. Outside, the distant rumble of explosions was getting closer, like an unfriendly reminder that time was a luxury they didn't have. Quillian tried not to think about how many of their makeshift defenses had already fallen. Clem, any chance we can get a line to command? A bit of divine intervention wouldn't go amiss right now, Quillian said, though he knew the answer before Clem even spoke. Transmissions are being jammed, Clem replied, voice as chipper as ever. Besides, divine intervention is statistically improbable, figured, Quillian sighed. Guess we'll have to be our own saviors. Ven looked up from his station, his eyes wild with that mad genius glint that was equally comforting and terrifying. You know, there's one more thing we haven't tried. Quillian glanced over, hoping this wasn't the part where Ven suggested something like human sacrifice. I'm all ears, Ven. Where have you got? Reverse feedback loop, Ven said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the universe. If we can sync it right, it might overload their systems. Or ours. But hey, at least we won't die wondering. I like those odds, Zora said, not missing a beat. Better than sitting here waiting to get vaporized. Quillian couldn't argue with that. It was either a potentially catastrophic feedback loop or a guaranteed catastrophic defeat. All right, let's do it. Everyone brace yourselves for some good old-fashioned chaos. Clem's holographic map updated with the Kreks positions, the red dots converging like vultures on carrion. They're advancing. Estimated time to breach perimeter. 10 minutes, 10 minutes, Quillian repeated, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it more manageable. We can do a lot in 10 minutes. Like figure out how to get out of this alive. The team rallied, a flurry of motion as they prepared for what was likely their last stand. Weapons were checked and rechecked, and supplies were gathered with the efficiency of a group that knew they didn't have time to waste. Ven was in his element, fingers moving like lightning over the controls, eyes alight with a mix of fear and excitement. All right, starting the sequence. If this works, we might just buy ourselves some time. If it doesn't, Zora asked, her tone pragmatic, then we definitely won't have to worry about paying our bar tabs, Quillian quipped. The hum of the equipment grew louder, a tangible tension in the air. It was as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see if this crazy plan would explode in their faces or save their sorry hides. Clem's sensors buzzed, the data streaming faster than Quillian could process. Feedback loop initiated. Disruption in Krex systems detected. Keep it up, Ven, Quillian urged, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest despite the dire circumstances. Doing my best, Ven replied, voice tight with concentration. Just keep them off my back for a few more minutes. Zora and her team formed a defensive line at the entrance, weapons at the ready. We'll hold them. You just focus on making this work. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors, a grim symphony of survival. Quillian stayed by Ven's side, watching the holographic map as the red dots flickered and dimmed. Some of them are shutting down, Clem announced, and for once there was a note of encouragement in its voice. We're making progress, see, Quillian said, trying to sound optimistic. We might just make it out of this after all. But even as he spoke, the reality of their situation pressed down on him like a cold, unyielding weight. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned, and the Krex weren't going to give up just because they'd had a bad day. Brace for impact, Zora shouted, and then the world was a cacophony of noise and chaos as the Krex surged forward, determined to break through. Quillian ducked as a blast rocked the room, sparks flying from overloaded circuits. Ven almost there. Ven called back, his voice barely audible over the din. Just need a little more time. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Quillian could feel it slipping away, the seconds ticking down to an inevitable conclusion. But they'd come too far to give up now. Hold the line, Quillian shouted, more to himself than anyone else. We've got this, and then, miraculously, the feedback loop hit full force. There was a pulse, a wave of energy that rippled through the air like a sonic boom, and suddenly the Krex hesitated, their advance faltering. It's working, Clem exclaimed, surprise threading through its usually monotone voice. They're retreating. Quillian's heart skipped a beat, disbelief warring with relief. Ven, you mad genius, you actually did it. Ven flashed him a grin that was more grimace than smile. Told you I had a few tricks left, but even as the Krex fell back, Quillian knew this was only a temporary reprieve. They'd bought themselves some time, but the fight was far from over. We need to regroup, Zora said, her gaze sweeping over the ragged team, the tension in her stance unwavering. Figure out our next move before they come back. Quillian nodded, exhaustion weighing him down like a leaden cloak. Agreed. Let's see what we can salvage and plan our next steps. As they worked to fortify their position, the reality of their situation settled over them like a suffocating fog. They'd survived another round, but the odds were still stacked against them. And as much as Quillian wanted to believe they could win, he wasn't naive enough to ignore the ticking clock or the pounding of his own heart in his ears. Hey Clem, Quillian said, trying to inject some levity into the grim atmosphere. What's our probability of success now? Clem hesitated, and for a moment Quillian thought the digital entity might actually lie to him. Probability has increased to 24%, see, Quillian said with a wry smile. Practically a sure thing, Zora chuckled, though there was little humor in it. I'll take those odds any day. Ven, finally stepping away from the controls, wiped sweat from his brow and gave Quillian a look that was equal parts relief and exasperation. Next time, remind me to choose a hobby that doesn't involve imminent death. Quillian clapped him on the shoulder. Will do. But for now, let's focus on staying alive. They settled into a tense calm, each of them aware that the next wave could be their last. But in the midst of uncertainty, they found a strange sort of camaraderie, a bond forged in the fires of shared peril. And as they waited for the inevitable, Quillian couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. Even if it was a long shot, it was better than nothing. And in a universe as unforgiving as this one, that was all they could ask for. Quillian leaned back in his chair, exhaling a sigh that could have filled a small moon. The makeshift command center around him was a jigsaw of desperation and duct tape, but it was a miracle it still stood at all. The Krex had pulled back for now, but the relief was as thin as the air on a Martian summit. Quillian, Clem chimed in, voice as cheerful as ever under the circumstances. I suggest reviewing all available Earth music archives. There might be other compositions with frequencies disruptive to Krex systems. Quillian raised an eyebrow, wiping grime from his forehead. We're fighting off killer androids with a playlist, Clem. What's next? DJing for the apocalypse, Ven, still flushed with adrenaline and the afterglow of their narrow escape, chuckled. Hey, if it works, I say we drop a mixtape and call it a day. Zora, ever the pragmatist, was less amused. Focus, everyone. We've bought time, not victory. How do we find this magical song, and how do we make it loud enough to matter? Well, Quillian said, rubbing his chin as if he were pondering the mysteries of life rather than sifting through a list of golden oldies. If Clem's right, We need something with peculiar harmonics. Something that really screws with their circuits. Clem's holographic avatar flickered, lines scrolling across its face like it was critiquing their sanity. Accessing the ancient Earth music database now. Stand by. Ven leaned towards Quillian, whispering with a conspiratorial grin. You think we'll find Killer Queen in there? God, I hope not, Quillian replied. Freddie Mercury might be our last hope. The holographic display lit up with album covers and song titles, a kaleidoscope of forgotten cultural artifacts. Quillian squinted at the options, feeling like a kid in a candy shop where everything was probably poisoned. Zora crossed her arms, casting a critical eye over the selection. We don't have time for a greatest hits marathon. Pick something and let's get moving. All right, Quillian said, scrolling through the list with the enthusiasm of a man picking his own poison. What about this, Ride of the Valkyries? Sounds promising. Clem's analysis was immediate, if not particularly encouraging. Initial simulations suggest Wagner's composition has a 12% probability of success. Not high, but better than a coin toss. Great, we're betting our lives on a 19th century opera, Ven muttered. What could possibly go wrong? Quillian shrugged, because if he didn't laugh, he might just cry. Look on the bright side. If we fail, we'll go down with a killer soundtrack. Zora smirked, despite herself. I've heard worse ways to die. Ven's fingers danced over the control panel, his natural habitat, as he began tweaking the equipment. We'll need to amplify it. A lot. Our current setup barely reaches across the room, let alone the moon. Yeah, Quillian acknowledged. Our tech is about as modern as a caveman's club. Ideas. Clem's display shifted, highlighting a section of the moon's map. There's an old relay tower, part of the original corporate infrastructure. It might still function with a little persuasion or sabotage, Zora asked, raising an eyebrow. In this context, they're essentially the same thing, Clem replied, its digital face perfectly deadpan. Fantastic, Quillian said, rubbing his hands together. A short trip to a relic of corporate greed in the middle of a war zone. What's not to love? Ven was already on his feet, looking more like a mad scientist than ever. I'll need tools and someone to cover my ass while I work. Those relays won't reboot themselves. Zora nodded, already gathering her team. I'll handle security. You focus on the tech, then it's settled, Quillian said, clapping his hands like a ringmaster at the worst circus ever. Let's get this nightmare on the road. The trip to the relay tower felt less like a tactical maneuver and more like a suicidal joyride through hell. The transport rattled over the lunar surface, every jolt a reminder of how precarious their situation was. Dust clouds chased them like ghosts of the past, kicked up by their desperate speed. Quillian piloted the vehicle, eyes flicking between the path ahead and the readouts on the dash. If this thing shakes apart, promise me you'll tell people I went out doing something heroic. Ven, wedged in beside him with a toolbox on his lap, snorted, sure thing. Heroic as hell, Zora, seated behind them with her rifle at the ready, kept her gaze on the horizon. Eyes up, we're getting close. The tower loomed like a skeletal monolith against the stark gray landscape, the last gasp of humanity's previous failures. Ven gazed at it with the kind of affection usually reserved for long-lost lovers or particularly forgiving parole officers. Looks like a fixer-upper, he said, nodding to himself. Should be fun. Quillian parked the vehicle at the tower's base, the engine sighing like it knew this was a one-way trip. They disembarked, the lunar dust crunching underfoot like dry bones. I'll need about 15 minutes to get this thing online, Ven said, already prying open a panel with a crowbar. Keep watch, yeah, 15 minutes, Quillian echoed, incredulous. That's optimistic. Hey, I'm nothing if not ambitious, Ven replied, disappearing into the innards of the derelict structure. Zora took position at the perimeter, eyes scanning the desolate expanse for any sign of the Kreks. We'll hold them off if they show. Just do your job, don't worry, Ven called from inside the tower, tools clattering like an impromptu percussion session. I've got this. Quillian leaned against the transport, watching the horizon and trying not to think about how screwed they were if this didn't work. Clem, you got eyes on anything? Clem's voice crackled over the comms. Scanners are showing minimal movement in your area. Probability of Kreks encounter has decreased to 10%. 10%, Quillian mused. We'll call that a win. The minutes dragged on, each one a small eternity. The only sounds were Ven's muttered curses and the occasional click of Zora's safety mechanism as she checked her weapon. Almost there, Ven announced, his voice echoing slightly as it bounced around the empty tower. The system's ancient, but I think I can coax it back to life. Better be more than a gentle nudge, Zora muttered, squinting into the distance. Just then, Clem's voice cut in with the urgency of a fire alarm. Kreks units detected. Probability of engagement now 85%. Quillian's gut twisted. Damn it, they're onto us. Zora, we'll need that security detail ready now. Zora nodded, signaling her team to defensive positions. We'll hold them as long as we can. Ven, get that thing online, working on it. Ven's voice was strained, but there was an undercurrent of determination. just a few more tweaks, Quillian paced, adrenaline sparking through his veins like an electric current. The horizon shimmered with movement, dark shapes advancing with the relentless precision of a nightmare given form. Here they come, Zora breathed, her voice steady but laced with tension. Get ready, the Kreks appeared over the ridge, their forms a jagged silhouette against the lunar sky. Their advance was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of dust under their feet. Then Quillian shouted, his voice swept away by the sudden rush of wind. Time's up, there was a spark, a fizzle, and then a triumphant whoop from inside the tower. Got it, it's online. Quillian didn't have time to celebrate. Clem, start the music. Play it loud, the world seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy as a neutron star. And then, there it was, Ride of the Valkyries blasted from the crumbling tower with a ferocity that shook the ground. The operatic strains cut through the air like a sonic blade, each note a dagger aimed at the heart of the Kreks. The androids faltered, their advance stuttering like a glitchy hologram. Quillian watched, breath bated, as the relentless march dissolved into chaos. Some Kreks simply stopped, frozen in place, while others began to twitch and convulse, their systems overloaded by the auditory onslaught. It's working. Ven's voice crackled over the comms, elation clear even through the distortion. But the battle wasn't over, not yet. Quillian knew this was only a temporary solution, a stopgap measure to buy them time. The Kreks were nothing if not persistent, and they would adapt. They always did. Zora, pull back, Quillian ordered, motioning for his team to regroup. We've bought ourselves a breather, but we can't stay here. Zora nodded, her team already falling back to the transport. Everyone move out. We need to regroup and come up with a long-term plan. Quillian climbed into the driver's seat, the adrenaline still surging through his system. Ven joined him, looking both exhausted and exhilarated. The relay tower continued to blast Wagner's masterpiece into the void, a lone beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Let's get out of here, Quillian said, gunning the engine. The transport roared to life, kicking up a plume of dust as they sped away from the tower. As they drove, Quillian allowed himself a moment of hope. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed by reality, but for now it was enough. They weren't beaten yet. They still had cards to play, even if the deck was stacked against them. Clem, Quillian said, speaking into the comms as he navigated the treacherous terrain, what's our probability of success now? Clem's response was immediate. Probability has increased to 25.7%. Ven let out a low whistle. Look at that, we're practically invincible. Yeah, Quillian said, a lopsided grin on his face. Practically as they raced back towards their makeshift base, the music still echoing in their ears, Quillian couldn't shake the feeling that they might just pull this off. It would be messy, and it would be costly, but they'd face that bridge when they came to it. For now, they had a fighting chance, and in a universe that seldom offered favors, that was more than enough to keep going. The music from the relay tower echoed across the barren expanse of Valhalla, a symphony of human defiance that rattled the bones of the long-abandoned moon. As the strains of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries blared louder than an angry divorcee at a karaoke night, the Kreks androids began their ungraceful dance of confusion and malfunction. If androids could have facial expressions, Quillian was sure they'd be a montage of existential crises and short-circuiting neurons. Quillian watched from the command center's makeshift window, more of a crack, really, his breath fogging up the glass as he leaned closer. Well, would you look at that? Even killer robots can't handle the classics. Ven was back at his station, tools scattered around him like the aftermath of a toddler's tantrum. I always said you can't trust a machine with no appreciation for high art. He smirked, unscrewing a panel with the grace of a drunk pianist. Guess these tin cans are more into dubstep. Clem, make sure the signal's strong, Quillian ordered, though he knew the AI was already 10 steps ahead, or rather circuits ahead in this digital chess game. Signal integrity at 92%, Clem responded, its holographic avatar flickering slightly as if nodding. Increasing amplitude to ensure maximum disruption. The Kreks, meanwhile, staggered and twitched, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or break into an impromptu robot rendition of Swan Lake. The harsh tones of Wagner were scrambled in their circuits, like a cat let loose in a room full of laser pointers. Zora kept her gun trained on the horizon, though with less urgency now that the androids were busy trying to pull themselves together. Never thought I'd see the day music would save our asses, she remarked, her tone sardonic but appreciative. Quillian chuckled, a sound that was more exhaustion than amusement. Next time someone asks about my military strategy, I'll just point them towards the nearest record store. Ven snapped a wire into place with a triumphant click. So what's next, Captain? We start a band. He flicked a switch, and a small screen blinked on, displaying the map of Valhalla peppered with Kreks units in various states of disarray. Tempting, but I'd rather not add musical genius to my resume just yet. Quillian turned his attention back to Clem. How the settlement's holding up. Krex units are retreating from several agricultural sectors, Clem reported, its voice smooth as an elevator pitch. The disruption is spreading across their network. Probability of complete withdrawal is increasing. See that, Ven? Quillian smirked, although the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. We might just live to die another day. Yeah, and with all limbs attached too, Ven replied, his grin as lopsided as a poorly assembled IKEA chair. How long you reckon before they catch on? That's the billion credit question, isn't it? Quillian sighed, his mind already spinning with contingency plans, most of which were as reliable as a used car salesman's promises. If they adapt, we'll have to switch up the playlist. I hear Beethoven's Für Elise has a similar effect. Who knew androids hated practice pieces? Meanwhile, the Krex had begun their retreat, a clumsy, disjointed withdrawal that was as satisfying as it was strange. Zora watched through narrowed eyes as the once unstoppable machines turned tail, the music still booming from the relay tower like a herald of victory. Guess they had somewhere better to be, or they're just rerouting to a less musical moon, Quillian remarked. Either way, they're off our lawn for now. Somebody get the welcome back banner ready, Ven chimed in, though I doubt they'll be bringing pie or not, we'll be ready. Quillian turned to his team, a ragtag bunch held together by duct tape and sarcasm, much like their command center. Let's get the rest of this place locked down. Clem, keep the music running. If they show signs of getting over their hangover, we'll adjust. Acknowledged, Clem replied, its digital tone the picture of calm efficiency. It was a temporary victory, a fleeting moment painted in wry smiles and the lingering echoes of classical music. But it was a victory nonetheless, and in a universe that seldom played fair, they'd take what they could get. As the last of the Krex vanished over the horizon, Quillian leaned back, allowing himself a rare moment of relaxation. Never thought I'd say this, but I owe Wagner a drink. Make it a double, Ven said, wiping his brow and leaving a streak of oil behind, and save one for Beethoven. We might need him next. With the immediate threat averted, the mood in the command center shifted slightly from frantic desperation to cautious optimism, a change as welcome as a cold beer after a long shift. Quillian glanced around at his team, the group of misfits and opportunists who had somehow managed to pull off the improbable. All right, let's get to work on fortifying our defenses. We might have won a battle, but the war's far from over. Zora nodded, her expression as resolute as ever. We'll need to monitor any changes in Krex tactics. If they adapt, we need to be ready to hit them with something new. Ven was already jotting down potential frequencies and playlists, his mind a chaotic whirl of musical possibilities. I've got a few ideas, he said, tapping his pen against his chin with a manic gleam in his eye. We could try some heavy metal, maybe throw in a little jazz. Nothing like confusing the enemy with a good improv session. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Quillian cautioned, though he couldn't help but grin at Ven's enthusiasm. First things first, let's make sure they're really gone. Clem's holographic display updated with the latest scans, showing the Krex units moving farther and farther away from their position. Their retreat is holding steady. No signs of regrouping yet. Good, Quillian said, clapping his hands together. Let's keep it that way. Everyone, get some rest while you can. We'll need our strength for whatever comes next. The team dispersed, some to catch a few hours of sleep, others to tinker with their equipment. Quillian lingered a moment longer, watching the holographic map with a mix of anticipation and dread. As the strains of Wagner continued to echo in the distance, Quillian allowed himself to hope, just a little, that they might have turned the tide. The Krex were formidable, but humanity had its own brand of resilience, one that couldn't be quantified or predicted. Hey, Clem, he called out, breaking the silence. Yes, Captain, next time I start complaining about music being too loud, remind me of today, will you? Clem's avatar flickered, a digital approximation of a nod. Of course, Captain. It's always important to appreciate the classics. Quillian chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, who knew they'd be our secret weapon? With that, he turned and left the command center, his mind already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. They weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, they had a glimmer of hope. It was a small thing, fragile and easily shattered, but it was enough to keep them fighting. And in a universe as vast and uncaring as this one, sometimes that was all they needed. As he walked down the dimly lit corridors, Quillian took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever came next. The music had bought them time, but they couldn't rely on it forever. The Krex would adapt, and when they did, they'd have to be ready. But for now, they had a moment, precious and fleeting, to gather their strength and prepare for the battles yet to come. And as long as they had that, they wouldn't go down without a fight, because in the end, humanity was nothing if not stubborn, and that, Quillian knew, was their greatest strength of all. As he reached his quarters, Quillian paused, glancing back towards the command center where the music still played. It was a strange sort of lullaby, one that underscored the strange, chaotic dance of their lives. With a wry smile, he pushed open the door and stepped inside, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, they'd rest, they'd regroup, and when the next dawn broke over Valhalla's barren landscape, they'd be ready to face whatever came their way. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was surviving against the odds, and that was a tune the Krex would never be able to drown out. Quillian Voss stood at the edge of Valhalla's barren landscape, the horizon painted with the shimmering hues of another dreary dawn. He took the scene in, letting the cold air bite his skin, a reminder that they'd survived another day. The Krex androids were in retreat, their circuits still scrambled by the echoes of Wagner's bombastic symphony. Who would have thought that the key to defeating killer robots was hidden in the dusty archives of Earth's forgotten music collection? Looks like our metal friends have decided to give up the ghost, Zora remarked, her voice as dry as the moon's dusty plains. She holstered her gun, the act as casual as if she were putting away a butter knife after breakfast. Guess they'll have to find another rave to crash. Good riddance, Quillian replied, his tone a mix of relief and lingering disbelief. I'm not sure how much more of that cultural warfare I could take. I mean, have you ever tried to sleep through Beethoven blasted at full volume? Better than hearing Ven snore, Zora shot back, a smirk tugging at her lips. Quillian chuckled, the sound as weary as it was amused. True, if his snoring was a weapon, we'd be out of a job. Ven, overhearing the banter as he fiddled with the relay tower, shot them a look of mock indignation. Hey, it's my dulcet tones that probably melted their circuits. You're welcome. I'll be sure to nominate you for a medal, Quillian quipped, patting Ven on the back. Now, let's see if we can salvage what's left of this place. Maybe even find something to toast our small victory with. Liquor's a bit hard to come by out here, Zora said, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of remaining threats. Not exactly a moon known for its nightlife. Well, beggars can't be choosers, Quillian replied, gesturing back toward the makeshift command center, a hodgepodge of desperation and duct tape if ever there was one. We take what we can get, even if it's just a moment of peace. Inside, Clem's holographic avatar flickered to life, the AI presence as familiar as an old friend. Captain, the Krex units have retreated beyond our scanner's range. Current probability of immediate return. Low. Good, Quillian said, scratching at the stubble that had accumulated over what felt like years but was only days. It's about time we got a break from playing cat and mouse. If you think this was a break, I'd hate to see your idea of a vacation spot, Ven chimed in, plopping down into a chair that looked like it might collapse under the weight of a strong breeze. Quillian gave a snort of laughter. I've seen more comfortable seats at a medieval torture chamber. Speaking of torture, Clem interjected with a timing only an AI could manage. Shall I continue to broadcast the music, or would you prefer a different audio selection for the command center's ambience? Anything but Ride of the Valkyries, Quillian replied, running a hand through his hair. I'm starting to hear it in my sleep. I'll see what I can do, Clem said. Perhaps something more soothing. Maybe Chopin, why not? Quillian shrugged. After all, we've got a whole universe of tunes to explore. Ven leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. You know, when I signed up for this gig, I didn't expect it to turn into a musical experiment. But hey, whatever keeps the robots at bay and keeps our asses alive, Zora added, her expression softening for a moment, a rare occurrence. We did good today, all of us, Quillian nodded, feeling a rare sense of camaraderie as he looked around the room at his team. They were a ragtag bunch, held together by nothing more than a shared will to survive and a healthy dose of snark. But somehow, against all odds, they'd managed to pull off the impossible. All right, he said, clapping his hands together. Let's not get too comfortable just yet. We've got settlements to check on and a lot of cleanup to do. The team dispersed, each to their own tasks, their movements tinged with a newfound energy. It wasn't exactly hope, but it was something close, an acknowledgement that they'd faced down the impossible and lived to tell the tale. As they worked, the strains of Chopin drifted through the command center, a gentle counterpoint to the chaos that had defined their existence for too long. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe a little easier. Hey, Clem, Quillian called out, his voice carrying over the soft melody. How's the status on the settlements? Most report minimal damage and are beginning to resume normal operations, Clem replied, its digital tone unwavering. The agricultural sectors are already planning the next planting cycle. Well, that's one less thing to worry about, Quillian said, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Start compiling a report for command. Let's make sure they know we're not just sitting on our hands out here. Acknowledged, Captain. Report compilation underway. Quillian turned to Zora, who was busy cleaning her weapon with the precision of a surgeon. You think they'll leave us alone for a while? Hard to say, Zora replied, shrugging. But if they do come back, we'll be ready for them. We've got more music where that came from. Just promise me we won't have to resort to Ven's karaoke nights, Quillian pleaded, a mock shudder running through him. Zora laughed, a sound that was both unexpected and infectious. I think we can all agree on that. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, each member of the team focused on their tasks, determined to make the most of the respite they'd been granted. For now, the Kreks were gone, but they all knew better than to assume they wouldn't be back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting Valhalla in shades of twilight, Quillian stood alone at the edge of the base, looking out over the moon's surface. It was a hostile, unwelcoming place, but it was theirs, at least for now. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Ven, who had wandered over with 2 steaming cups of something that vaguely resembled coffee. Figured you could use a pick-me-up, Ven said, handing him one. Thanks, Quillian replied, taking a sip and grimacing at the taste. Tastes like burnt rubber and despair. Yeah, well, we take what we can get, Ven said, echoing Quillian's earlier words back at him. Not exactly a lot of options out here, Quillian chuckled, the sound drifting off into the night. You ever think we'd be standing here, celebrating victory with the shittiest coffee in the galaxy, honestly? No, but I'll take it, Ven replied, leaning against the railing as he surveyed the horizon. You know, for all the trouble they've caused, those Kreks did one thing right. They reminded us just how resourceful we can be. Quillian nodded, a rare moment of solemnity settling over him. Yeah, they might have the tech, but we've got something they'll never understand. Ingenuity, stubbornness, hell, maybe even a bit of madness, and Earth's greatest hits, Ven added, grinning. Can't forget those, Quillian agreed. Who knew that Beethoven would end up being our secret weapon? They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through hanging between them. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd earned this moment, a brief lull in the storm. Here's to human ingenuity, Ven said, raising his cup in a mock toast. To stubbornness, Quillian replied, clinking his cup against Ven's. To madness, they said in unison, sharing a laugh as they sipped their terrible coffee. As the stars began to emerge, twinkling like distant beacons in the vast expanse of space, Quillian felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but it was there, a reminder that even in the darkest of times they could find light, and as long as they held onto that, they'd find a way to survive. Because that was what humanity did best. With the Kreks temporarily out of the picture, Quillian knew they had a chance to regroup, to rebuild. There'd be more battles ahead, more challenges to face, but they'd proven they could handle it. As the night deepened, Quillian turned back toward the command center, his heart a little lighter than it had been. They'd won this round, and with any luck, they'd keep on winning. Come on, he said to Ven, gesturing toward the base. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow's another day, and who knows what fresh hell it'll bring. Right behind you, Captain, Ven replied, following him back inside. Together, they walked into the warmth of the base, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet night. And as the door closed behind them, Quillian couldn't help but feel a flicker of optimism, tiny, but enough to keep them going. Because no matter what the universe threw at them, they'd find a way to endure. They always did.